Today we're going to explore one of the greatest misconceptions that popular history has ever built about the human beings of the past. The idea that people in the Middle Ages lived immersed in filth, never touched water, and completely ignored any notion of personal hygiene. Before we continue with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is a portrait of the Middle Ages that has taken hold in the collective imagination with surprising force. Streets choked with garbage, citizens covered in mud, bodies that never met water, and a humanity oblivious to any practice of cleanliness. This image inhabits films, series, textbooks, and everyday conversations with an almost unquestionable authority. For centuries, it has been passed down from generation to generation as consecrated historical truth, so firmly established that rarely has anyone stopped to ask, but after all, is it true? The answer, as often happens when you take a closer look at the past, is far more complex and revealing than common sense suggests. Before any investigation, it's necessary to understand where this myth comes from. It did not arise from nowhere. It was not invented by a single author, nor propagated by a single work. It was built slowly, over centuries, from misconceptions, hasty interpretations, and a deliberately condescending gaze cast by later generations upon the men and women who lived between the 5th and 15th centuries of the Christian era. The Middle Ages, that vast period of roughly 1,000 years separating classical antiquity from the Renaissance, was for a long time treated by historiography as a dark parenthesis in the human trajectory, an interval of shadows between Greco-Roman luminosity and the intellectual reawakening that would follow. And within this simplified framework, dirt served as the perfect metaphor. If the era was obscure, its inhabitants must have been equally obscure, even in the physical sense. But history rarely lets itself be squeezed into such tidy metaphors. When historians began to examine medieval documents with greater rigor, illuminated manuscripts, monastery records, medical treatises of the time, and domestic inventories, a radically different picture started to emerge. Not one of a civilization indifferent to cleanliness, but of a society with its own values and hygiene rituals, adapted to the material and cultural conditions of its time. To understand this picture, we must start with a fundamental point, the very concept of hygiene. What does it mean to be clean? The modern answer involves a daily bath with hot water, industrialized soap, deodorant, toothpaste, and an entire infrastructure of products that only became universally accessible in the 20th century. When we apply this standard to any earlier period, the inevitable conclusion is that the past was dirty. But this reasoning makes a serious mistake. It confuses technological standard with cultural awareness. The absence of a product is not necessarily the absence of a value. Medieval populations did not have showers with running water or industrialized soap. But that does not mean they were indifferent to bodily cleanliness. It means they took care of their bodies according to the resources available, the knowledge they possessed, and the values that guided their worldview. And when we examine these elements carefully, the narrative of the filthy medieval person begins to crumble with disconcerting speed. Consider the public bath. One of the most effective ways to dismantle the myth is to note that public baths, known in Europe as stews or thermae, in direct inheritance from the Roman tradition, existed and thrived in medieval cities across the continent. In 13th century Paris, dozens of public bathhouses were registered by municipal authorities. In London, in the cities of the Holy Roman Empire, on the Iberian Peninsula, and in communal Italy, these spaces were an integral part of urban life. They were not marginal or clandestine locales. They were recognized establishments, regulated by municipalities, and frequented by people from different social strata. The very regulation of these spaces says something fundamental. Collective hygiene was institutionalized, anticipated, and expected by medieval society. As the investigation progresses, other elements emerge. The medical treatises of the time, many derived from the Hippocratic tradition and enriched by influences from the Islamic world, explicitly recommended bodily cleanliness as an essential condition for health. Medieval medicine understood that filth was associated with disease, even if it did not know the microbiological mechanisms that modern science would unveil centuries later. In monasteries, intellectual centers of enormous importance, cleanliness was a regulated part of communal life. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided thousands of monastic communities, prescribed obligatory times for bathing and bodily care. Physical cleanliness was understood, within the context of Christian theology, as an extension of spiritual cleanliness. The human body, as a divine creation, deserved care and respect. This link between bodily hygiene and spiritual virtue is one of the most fascinating threads running through this investigation. It reveals that medieval culture constructed sophisticated symbolic systems in which hygiene went far beyond the purely functional. Washing oneself was not merely a matter of health or comfort. In many contexts, it was an act with moral and religious dimensions, embedded in a coherent worldview. But here the story begins to reveal its more complex layers, because if, on one hand, the Church encouraged certain forms of bodily care, on the other hand there were theological currents that associated physical austerity and indifference to appearance with a form of piety and detachment from the material world. This internal tension within medieval culture is precisely what makes the question of hygiene so fascinating and so systematically misunderstood by posterity. The myth did not spring from a void. It arose from a partial, selective, and anachronistic reading of a complex reality. It took the extreme examples, the exceptions, the contexts of crisis or poverty, and generalized them to an entire civilization that lasted 1,000 years and stretched across a continent, spanning profoundly different climates, cultures, and realities. Over the coming chapters, this investigation will deepen. We will examine hygiene practices across different social strata, from peasants to European royal courts. We will explore the role of the Islamic world and its influences on medieval habits. We will investigate how the great crises, particularly the Black Death of the 14th century, transformed conceptions of cleanliness and collective health. And we will follow the precise moment when this myth began to be constructed, and the reasons why it was so conveniently preserved. Understanding how a historical distortion is born and perpetuated is as important as knowing the truth it conceals. And in this case, the truth is at once more mundane and more fascinating than any fiction could be. The Middle Ages has been misjudged for far too long, and this investigation begins now. To understand what happened to hygiene in medieval Europe, one must step back in time beyond the borders of that era itself. One must return to the centuries of Roman dominion, when bathing was not a private, occasional act, but a public social ritual deeply rooted in the identity of a civilization. Because the history of medieval hygiene begins, in many ways, long before the Middle Ages. Rome was a city of water. At its height, the capital of the empire boasted more than 900 public bath establishments, the so-called balnea, in addition to the great imperial thermae. The baths of Caracalla, inaugurated in the 3rd century, could accommodate more than 1,500 people simultaneously. The baths of Diocletian reached twice that capacity. These were not simply places to wash, they were centers of social, political, and cultural life, where citizens of different stations met, debated, negotiated, and rested. The Roman bath was democratic in its vocation. The entrance fee was symbolic, affordable to most of the urban population. There were free admission days, sponsored by victorious generals or politicians seeking prestige. The thermae had rooms of progressive heat, spaces of intermediate temperature, cold water areas, and areas for physical exercise. Bathing was, in Rome, synonymous with civility. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the assumption arose among historians of the following centuries that the culture of bathing had simply disappeared with it, as if the political abandonment of the Roman structure had dragged along all the habits and values it had cultivated. It is an understandable assumption, but largely mistaken. The Roman heritage did not disappear, it was transformed. In many European cities that had been significant centers under Roman rule, the structures of the ancient thermae survived in varied states of preservation. Some were repurposed, others served as models, and throughout the medieval Europe that emerged from the ruins and continuities of the Roman world, the practice of public bathing found ways to perpetuate itself, adapting to new political and cultural conditions. In the 11th and 12th centuries, As European cities grew again with the commercial revival and population increase, public baths reappeared with renewed vitality. In Paris, establishments known as étuves proliferated in the busiest urban neighborhoods. Municipal regulations from the 13th century describe precisely the functioning of these places: opening hours, prices charged, distinctions between the different services offered. The baths had their own trade associations, their masters and apprentices, their fiscal obligations to the authorities. This documentation is extraordinarily revealing. It shows that the medieval public bath was not a marginal practice. It was a recognized, taxed, regulated service integrated into the city's economy. 13th century Parisian documents even list more than 26 bath establishments in a single municipal inventory. London presented a similar picture. In the Suffolk region, on the south bank of the Thames, there was a notable concentration of public baths in the 12th and 13th centuries. The English crown even regulated them in detail, stipulating obligations for both owners and patrons. The existence of royal regulation of these places is evidence that it was an economically relevant and socially visible sector of English urban life. In Germany, the imperial cities had so-called Badestuben, steam bath establishments that blended elements of Roman tradition with Scandinavian and Slavic influences. In Nuremberg, Frankfurt, and Cologne, these places were so common and frequented that the urban chronicles of the time rarely described them. Just as no one today writes about the routine of visiting a supermarket, it was too ordinary to warrant special comment. This detail deserves attention. One of the reasons why records about medieval baths are less abundant than one might expect is precisely because the practice was too common to be noticed. Historical sources tend to record the extraordinary, the unusual. Everyday life rarely earns the ink of a scribe or chronicler. The lack of exhaustive records about medieval bathing does not mean it did not exist. It often means it was so commonplace that it needed no explanation. There is, however, one element of the Roman heritage that deserves particular attention: the question of water. The great thermae depended on sophisticated aqueducts. When these systems were abandoned with the collapse of imperial administration, medieval cities had to find alternative solutions. And they did. Wells, fountains, and rivers that cut through medieval urban fabrics served as sources of supply. The establishments developed their own systems for capturing and heating water, using metal boilers fueled by firewood. It was a system less monumental than the Roman aqueducts, but functionally effective within the possibilities of the time. There are records of regions where the organization of supply was done collectively, with agreements between different establishments or with municipal authorities. Another relevant aspect is the social dimension of the space. Just as in the ancient thermae, medieval baths were meeting places. People went to wash, but also to talk, do business, and maintain social relations. There are accounts of establishments where food and drink were served, where music was played, where bodily hygiene turned into an occasion for socializing. For now, what matters is to retain this portrait, that of the medieval Europe of the 11th to 13th centuries, as a place where public bathing was not the exception, but the rule. Where cities of different sizes, in different countries, under different political authorities, maintained establishments of collective hygiene. Where the Roman heritage had survived not only in the stones of ancient buildings, but in the living habit of a population that understood bodily cleanliness as a natural part of life in society. The myth of the dirty medieval man finds no foundation here. It finds, on the contrary, a solid, documented, and geographically broad refutation, and as this investigation progresses, other refutations will accumulate, coming from increasingly unexpected directions. If the Roman heritage provided one of the pillars upon which the culture of medieval European hygiene was sustained, a second, equally essential pillar came from a direction that popular imagination rarely considers: the Islamic world. It is one of the most revealing ironies of this history that the civilization which medieval Europe often defined as an adversary or a radical other was, at the same time, one of its most influential teachers in matters of cleanliness, medicine, and care for the body. Islam, as a religious and cultural tradition, established from its earliest centuries a very particular relationship with hygiene. This was not an optional or peripheral relationship. On the contrary, it was a central one, codified in the fundamental religious practices of the faith. The ritual obligations of Islam prescribe ablutions, that is, specific body washings, before the 5 daily prayers. Bodily cleanliness, in this context, was not separable from spiritual purity. It was its condition. And this religious imperative had far-reaching practical consequences for the entire civilization that developed under Islamic influence. The hammam, the Islamic public bath, became one of the most characteristic and widespread institutions of the medieval Muslim world. Unlike the Roman baths, whose character was primarily social and whose access depended on a monumental urban structure, the hammam was integrated into the religious and everyday fabric of Islamic communities. In every city of any size in the medieval Islamic world, from Persia to the Iberian Peninsula, hammams operated regularly. In many cases, there were several distributed across different neighborhoods and meeting the varied needs of the population. Baghdad, at the height of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 9th and 10th centuries, was described by contemporary travelers as a city of baths. Historical records point to the existence of thousands of public baths in the Abbasid capital during this period. The Caliphate of Cordoba, which transformed the Iberian Peninsula into one of the most advanced intellectual and cultural centers of the medieval West, maintained in its cities a dense network of hammams that served the Muslim, Christian and Jewish populations living together in that singular space. It is here that history assumes one of its most fascinating dimensions. Medieval Christian Europe did not live in hermetic isolation from the Islamic world. It lived in permanent contact, tense and conflict-ridden at many moments, but also profoundly productive from a cultural and intellectual standpoint. The Iberian Peninsula was the densest and most enduring point of contact. For centuries, the regions under Islamic control and the Christian regions of Iberia coexisted in a complex relationship that historians call convivencia, a state of coexistence that was never simple or peaceful, but which allowed for extraordinarily deep cultural exchanges. Cities like Toledo, reconquered by Christians in 1085, preserved functioning hammams for decades, sometimes for centuries after passing into Christian control. Islamic cleanliness did not disappear with the change in political power. It continued, adapted, and reinterpreted. Sicily presents an equally interesting case. The island, which was under Islamic rule between the 9th and 11th centuries and later passed into Norman control, functioned as a laboratory of cultural synthesis. The Norman kings of Sicily governed a multi-confessional population and maintained a court that absorbed elements of Arab, Greek, and Latin cultures with a remarkable openness for the standards of the time. Sicilian hammams from this period are documented and archaeologically verified, representing a continuity of Islamic practice under Christian administration. The Crusades, the conflict that dominates the popular imagination when one thinks of relations between the Christian and Islamic worlds in the Middle Ages, also played their role in this history. The Crusaders who arrived in the Middle East brought back with them upon their return not only relics and spices but also observations about the customs of a civilization that lived with a comfort and sophistication that surprised them. Crusader chronicles describe with wonder the baths of the East and the organization of Islamic cities. These accounts circulated throughout Europe and helped transmit knowledge and spark interest. But the deepest influence of the Islamic world on medieval European hygiene did not come through battlefields or Iberian borders. It came through books. Medieval Islamic medicine was one of the most advanced in the known world, and it attributed a central role to personal hygiene in the maintenance of health. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote in the 11th century the Canon of Medicine, an encyclopedic work that would become one of the most influential medical texts in Western history. In it, bodily hygiene is treated not as a secondary or convenience issue, but as an essential component of preventive health. Regular bathing, cleaning of hair and skin, dental care, and control of the environment in which one lives are explicit medical prescriptions, grounded in a system of understanding the human body that was sophisticated for its time. Avicenna's canon was translated into Latin in the 12th century, within the context of the great movement of translations that transformed the knowledge available in medieval Europe. Along with other Arabic medical texts, it became part of the curriculum of the nascent European universities, including the medical faculties of Bologna, Montpellier, and Paris. European doctors trained from the 12th century onward were therefore educated in a tradition that placed hygiene at the center of preventive medicine. This has direct implications for the debate on medieval hygiene. The most qualified medical professionals of Christian Europe from the 12th century onward prescribed regular baths, recommended dental cleaning, and provided guidance on skin care. Their guidance reached the elites who hired them, and to some extent percolated to the rest of the population through communal spaces, religious practices, and the social norms that formed around urban life. The Islamic influence on medieval European hygiene is therefore not a niche historical curiosity. It is one of the structural elements that help explain why medieval Europe was not, by any means, as careless with cleanliness as the myth suggests. It is also a reminder that history rarely fits within the borders that political and religious conflicts try to impose. Ideas, habits, and knowledge cross wars, overcome persecutions, and find ways to propagate, even when circumstances seem to conspire in the opposite direction. And while this web of influences spread throughout Europe, inside monasteries, royal courts, and peasant villages, other practices and other values regarding the body and cleanliness were taking shape. It is toward this inner world of medieval society, toward its contradictions and its richness, that this investigation will turn next. Medieval Europe was not a uniform society. It was a mosaic of profoundly distinct conditions, resources, and realities, separated not only by geography, but by the rigid structure of a social order that precisely determined what each individual could access, consume, and aspire to. And when it comes to hygiene, this stratification matters enormously, because understanding how different layers of medieval society related to bodily cleanliness is fundamental to demystifying both the exaggeration and the simplification that dominate the popular debate on the subject. Let us begin with the peasant, the figure who perhaps most concentrates the stereotypes of the dirty medieval, the rural worker tied to the land, to intense physical labor, to the modest conditions of a life that depended on harvest cycles and the mercy of the climate, is often portrayed as the apex of medieval filth. But this portrait, once again, collapses before the historical evidence. Medieval peasants had limited, but not non-existent access to hygiene practices. Rivers, streams, and springs that ran through or around rural villages served as collective bathing sites, especially in the warmer months. There are literary and iconographic records showing scenes of river bathing as part of rural daily life, in some cases associated with seasonal festivities or the agricultural calendar. The connection between water, cleanliness, and certain ritual moments of the year was an integral part of medieval popular culture, blending Christian elements and residues of pre-Christian traditions that the Church never managed to completely eradicate. Beyond baths in running water, peasants produced and used soap. The manufacture of soap from wood ash and animal fat was a widespread artisanal process in medieval rural communities, documented from the early Middle Ages in different regions of Europe. It was not a refined soap, of course, but it served its function as a cleaning agent. The surviving medieval household inventories list, with notable frequency, hygiene-related materials among the belongings of peasant families, including water containers, combs, and simple toiletry tools. It is equally important to consider the cleaning of clothes. Medieval peasants did not have many garments, it is true, but they washed those they did have regularly. The laundresses, women who worked professionally washing other people's clothes, were a recognized labor category in medieval towns and villages. The act of washing clothes in rivers or troughs was such a common scene in medieval daily life that it appears repeatedly in the iconography of the period, from the illustrated calendars of books of hours to the marginal decorations of manuscripts. It was hard, physical, demanding work, but it was work carried out regularly. If the peasant condition offered limited but real access to hygiene, the situation of the upper layers of medieval society presents a much more elaborate picture. The medieval nobility developed over the centuries a culture of bodily care that mixed hygiene, aesthetics, and the display of social status. For a noble, presenting oneself clean, well-dressed, and perfumed was part of the language of power. Bodily appearance communicated position, discipline, and control, values central to the medieval aristocratic identity. Neglect of the body was, in this context, not merely a personal failing, but a social transgression, a sign of degeneracy or absence of virtue. Medieval castles and noble residences had structures dedicated to bathing. The so-called bath chambers or private stoves appear in the inventories of many European noble residences from the 12th century onward. The bathtub, often made of wood and waterproofed with wax or pitch, was an object present in the homes of wealthy families. There were servants whose specific function included preparing the bath, heating the water, and caring for the lord or lady's toilet items. The courtesy manuals, texts that circulated widely in European courts from the 12th century onward and prescribed proper behavior for aristocratic life, devoted considerable attention to personal hygiene. Works such as the Facetus, widely read in medieval courts, and later texts like the 16th century Italian Galateo, which synthesized centuries of courtly tradition, included explicit prescriptions about cleaning the teeth, hands, face, and body. Washing hands before meals was not only a hygiene practice, but a social ritual observed rigorously in noble settings, as evidenced by banquet records and aquamanile objects, ornate vessels used specifically to pour water over the hands of diners. The use of perfumes, aromatic herbs, and cosmetic substances in medieval courts is yet another element that challenges the narrative of widespread filth. The trade in spices and aromatic substances was one of the most profitable in the Middle Ages, precisely because there was consistent demand for these products among the wealthy classes. Roses, lavender, rosemary, and a host of other plants were used both to perfume the body and clothing and to scent domestic spaces. The medieval recipe books that have come down to us include surprisingly elaborate cosmetic preparations, tooth cleaning pastes, hair care preparations, skin ointments. In royal courts, bodily care reached its most elaborate peak. Medieval kings and queens had access to heated bathtubs, perfumers, personal physicians who prescribed hygiene and health regimens, an entire sophisticated infrastructure of bodily care within the limits of their time. The expense records of the English, French, and Iberian courts in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries include regular purchases of soap, bath herbs, combs, and other toilet articles. Queen Isabel of Bavaria, who became Queen of France upon marrying Charles VI at the end of the 14th century, brought with her from Bavaria personal hygiene practices that impressed the French court. The records describe her bathing rituals and skin care as something worthy of note, suggesting they were not universal, but neither were they incomprehensible to those around her. What emerges from this stratified panorama is a more nuanced image than any stereotype could capture. Medieval hygiene was real, but it was unequal. The resources available to a 13th century Burgundian peasant were radically different from those within reach of a Flemish count or an English king. But across all strata, there was some practice of bodily care. There was an awareness of cleanliness as a value and a genuine effort to achieve it. And there was, above all, a moral dimension to this pursuit, an understanding that a clean body said something about the spirit, about character, about the individual's place in the order of the world. It is toward this moral and religious dimension, with all its tensions and contradictions, that this investigation will turn in the next chapter. Few claims about the Middle Ages circulate with as much confidence as this one. The Catholic Church forbade bathing. In more elaborate versions of the myth, medieval clerics supposedly taught that bodily filth was a sign of holiness, that washing the body was a sinful act, and that the great saints of Christendom were distinguished precisely by their contempt for hygiene. It is a narrative seductive in its simplicity, and it is profoundly mistaken. The relationship between medieval Christianity and the body is in truth one of the most complex and ambiguous in all of religious history. It cannot be reduced to a single stable and coherent position spanning 10 centuries, because the Church itself was not a monolithic block. It was a vast institution, internally diverse, crisscrossed by sometimes conflicting theological currents, and expressed differently depending on the era and the cultural context in which it operated. To understand this complexity, it is necessary to carefully distinguish between two phenomena that popular myth confuses: the individual asceticism of certain saints and hermits, on the one hand, and the doctrinal and practical position of the Church as an institution on the other. It is true that some of the so-called Desert Fathers, the first Christian monks who withdrew into the wilderness of Egypt and Syria from the 3rd century onward, cultivated extreme forms of bodily mortification that included deliberate neglect of personal hygiene. Figures such as Simeon Stylites, who lived for decades atop a pillar in the Syrian desert, or certain Egyptian hermits whose stories were compiled by early Christian writers, are cited as examples of Christian indifference to the body. But this is precisely the sort of generalization that rigorous historical inquiry cannot accept. These cases were by definition extraordinary. They were recorded and preserved precisely because they represented an extreme, a form of devotion considered exceptional and admirable in its radicality. The vast majority of medieval Christians, including the vast majority of clergy, monks and nuns, did not follow these extreme ascetic examples. They were admired from afar as models of heroic virtue, in the same way that one might today admire an athlete who completes an ultramarathon in the Arctic, without aspiring to replicate the feat. The institutional stance of the medieval church toward bathing was, in practice, far more favorable to hygiene than the myth suggests. The sacrament of baptism itself, central to the Christian faith and obligatory for all believers from birth, is an act of purification by water. The symbolic dimension of water as an element of spiritual cleansing permeated the entire Christian liturgy. The ritual ablutions of priests during Mass, the holy water at the entrances of churches, the washing of feet in the mandatum ceremony on Holy Thursday, when bishops and abbots washed the feet of the poor or of their subordinates in imitation of Christ's gesture. All of this pointed to a theological tradition that associated cleanliness with virtue and with proximity to the sacred. In the monastic environment, which constituted one of the most important poles of medieval cultural life, hygiene was regulated and practiced systematically. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and adopted by countless monastic communities throughout the entire Middle Ages, stipulated that monks should wash their clothes regularly and provided for times of bodily care. The chapter dedicated to the monastery barber, an office that included the cutting of hair and beard and could also involve broader hygiene care, appears explicitly in the rule and its derivatives. The cleanliness of the monastic environment, the cells, the refectory, the kitchen, was a communal obligation distributed among the members of the community. Benedictine, Cistercian and other monastic orders frequently maintained water supply infrastructures that were among the most sophisticated in medieval Europe. The monastic aqueducts that brought fresh water to the monastery buildings, the lavabos where monks washed before meals, the sanitation systems that kept the environment free of waste. All of this represents a collective effort on behalf of hygiene that can hardly be reconciled with the image of a church hostile to cleanliness. But there is one aspect of the church's relationship with bathing that deserves closer examination, because it is here that complexity becomes most evident. At a certain point, some ecclesiastical voices began to express reservations, not about bathing itself, but about mixed public baths, where men and women bathed together and where intense sociability created, from the perspective of religious moralists, opportunities for improper behavior. Certain medieval councils and preachers prohibited or discouraged attendance at certain types of bathhouses, especially those that had acquired morally ambiguous reputations. This distinction is crucial. What was being questioned was not bathing itself. It was the specific social context of certain public baths, and even that criticism was far less universal and systematic than the myth suggests. The very councils that discouraged attendance at certain establishments implicitly recognized the legitimacy of bathing in other contexts. Medieval ecclesiastical documents far more often show concern for the morality of behaviors in the baths than for the practice of bathing itself. It is also significant that the medieval church in many cities was one of the entities responsible for maintaining water supply infrastructures. Bishops who built fountains, abbots who funded aqueducts, orders that managed hospitals where cleanliness was part of caring for the sick. This is the institutional face that rarely appears in popular discussions on the topic. The myth of the church as an enemy of bathing has survived in part because there is a human tendency to simplify complex institutions into singular, coherent positions. In part also because some real examples of extreme asceticism or moral criticism of certain baths were decontextualized and generalized, and in part still because the anti-clericalism of the 18th and 19th centuries found in the image of a dirty and ignorant church a convenient rhetorical tool, as we will see later in this investigation. What history shows, when examined rigorously, is an institution that, like all great human institutions, contained within itself contradictions, tensions, and diverse voices. That preached the mortification of the body and, at the same time, its dignity as a divine creation. That produced both the dirty hermits of the desert and the engineer monks who built aqueducts. That was, in different times and places, both an obstacle and a promoter of medieval hygiene. And while the Church navigated these internal contradictions, the world outside was experiencing one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, a catastrophe that would irreversibly transform medieval conceptions of cleanliness, contagion, and collective health. It is toward this decisive moment that the investigation now turns. In the autumn of 1347, Genoese ships arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily, carrying crew members who had already succumbed during the crossing or were in a very serious condition. The port authorities ordered the ships to leave the port. But it was too late. What those ships carried had already disembarked, and over the following 3 years, Europe experienced one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in its history: the Black Death. It is estimated that between a third and half of the European population perished between 1347 and 1351. Some regions were even more devastated. Mortality varied according to population density, trade routes, and other factors that contemporaries did not understand, leaving them terrified before an invisible enemy. The Black Death was not only a human tragedy of unimaginable proportions, it was also a moment of rupture that forever transformed how medieval Europe thought about health, contagion, cleanliness, and the vulnerability of the human body before the forces of nature. For this investigation on hygiene, the Black Death matters for reasons that go far beyond the simple record of a calamity. It matters because it generated responses that reveal, very clearly, what medieval society understood about the relationship between environment and disease, and because it produced changes in public hygiene practices that are often misinterpreted by posterity. The first thing to understand is that medieval society was not passive in the face of the plague. It reacted within the limits of available knowledge with considerable energy and creativity. The Italian cities, which were among the first to be struck and which had more sophisticated administrative structures, responded with measures that anticipated, in some respects, principles of public health that would only be systematized much later. Venice was the first city to institute a form of quarantine in 1377, decreeing that ships and travelers arriving from affected regions should remain isolated for a period of time before entering the city. The term quarantine derives from the Italian quarantina, referring to the 40 days of isolation originally stipulated, a number that had both practical and symbolic resonance within Christian culture. The idea of isolating the potentially sick to protect the healthy community is, in essence, a principle of public health rigorously modern in its spirit, albeit primitive in its execution. Other Italian cities created permanent health commissions, municipal bodies tasked with monitoring the health status of the population and adopting preventive measures. Florence, Milan, Venice, and Genoa developed over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries administrative structures dedicated specifically to public health, which included market controls, regulation of waste disposal, and isolation of the sick. These commissions represent, in many respects, the first outlines of what would become public health as an organized administrative field. With regard directly to public baths, the Black Death brought a significant change that has been systematically misinterpreted. In many European cities, public bathhouses were closed or severely restricted during and after plague outbreaks. This closure is often cited as proof of the relationship between bathing and disease, or as evidence that medieval society believed water was dangerous. But this interpretation, once again, ignores the context. Medieval medicine, following the humoral theories inherited from antiquity and the Islamic elaborations on the subject, understood that the heat and moisture associated with hot baths could open the pores of the skin and thereby make the body more vulnerable to external influences considered causes of disease. This theory was wrong from a microbiological standpoint, of course, but it was the most coherent explanation available within the medical system of the time for what was observed. People who frequented places of large gatherings, such as public baths, succumbed more often than those who remained isolated. What medieval medicine was intuiting, imperfectly but not completely wrongly, was the mechanism of contagion. They did not understand microbial agents, but they perceived that proximity to affected people and to certain environments increased the risk of falling ill. The closure of public baths during plague outbreaks was therefore a public health measure based on an incorrect causal theory, but guided by an epidemiological observation that contained a real grain of truth. Enclosed spaces with many people favored the spread of the disease. It is important to emphasize that this closure was temporary and circumstantial. After the outbreak subsided, public baths often resumed their operation. But the repeated plague outbreaks throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, which struck Europe at intervals of decades, gradually eroded the culture of collective public baths, especially in the most severely affected regions. It was a slow process, not a single, deliberate decision. There is another dimension of the medieval response to the plague that deserves attention: the effort toward urban cleanliness. In several European cities, municipal authorities responded to epidemics by attempting to clean and sanitize public spaces, remove accumulated debris from streets, regulate waste disposal, and control commercial activities that generated filth. These measures stemmed from an intuition, not always clearly articulated, that environmental dirt was linked to disease. This intuition was not entirely misguided. Although the Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted mainly by rodent fleas, was not directly caused by a lack of urban hygiene, poor sanitary conditions favored the proliferation of the rodents that carried the disease vectors. The medieval attempts to clean cities, rudimentary as they were, contained a logic that pointed, albeit imprecisely, in the right direction. The Black Death, in short, is not evidence of medieval filth. It is evidence of human fragility before a pathogenic agent that no 14th century civilization, regardless of its hygiene habits, could have effectively confronted. And it is evidence at the same time of a society's capacity for response, a society that, within the severe limits of its knowledge, developed public health tools that would leave lasting marks on the history of preventive medicine. What the plague catastrophe revealed, more than anything else, was the depth of human ignorance about the mechanisms of disease. And that ignorance, combined with the collective trauma of an unprecedented demographic loss, opened the way for alternative explanations of why the medieval period was dirty and ignorant. Explanations that, as we will see in the next chapter, were constructed not by medieval contemporaries, but by the generations that came after. The time has come to answer the question that has silently guided this entire investigation. If the Middle Ages were not the world of universal filth that popular imagination describes, where did this portrait come from? Who built it, when, and for what purpose? For historical myths are rarely innocent. They serve a purpose, and the myth of the dirty medieval is no exception. The history of the construction of this misunderstanding begins, ironically, with one of the most celebrated intellectual movements of the Western tradition, the Renaissance. The humanists of the 14th and 15th centuries, in rediscovering classical Greek and Latin texts and turning with renewed enthusiasm toward the Greco-Roman heritage, needed a contrast. To valorize what they were rescuing, they had to diminish what had come before. For the Renaissance to shine, the Middle Ages had to be dark. It was the Italian poet and humanist Francesco Petrarca in the 14th century who coined the expression that would define the earlier period as an age of darkness, the Dark Ages. Petrarch was not describing historical reality with analytical rigor. He was constructing a rhetorical narrative that served his intellectual and aesthetic purposes. The contrast between classical luminosity and medieval obscurity was an argumentative tool, not a historical diagnosis. But that tool was extraordinarily powerful and enduring. The following centuries amplified and diversified the myth. The 18th century Enlightenment, with its valorization of reason, science, and progress, found in the Middle Ages the perfect example of what the civilized world had overcome. The Enlightenment philosophers, many of them deeply anti-clerical, used the image of the ignorant and dirty Middle Ages as a rhetorical weapon against the Church and everything it represented. If the era dominated by religion was dark, superstitious, and filthy, that served perfectly the thesis that reason and science were superior to faith and tradition. It is precisely here that one of the sharpest ironies of this entire story lies. The myth of the dirty medieval man, often presented as a product of modern scientific knowledge about hygiene, was largely constructed by the same thinkers who helped found that scientific knowledge. The doctors and hygienists of the 19th century, in identifying dirt as a cause of disease and in promoting modern hygiene as a civilizational achievement, needed a dirty past that could serve as a glorious contrast. The Middle Ages conveniently filled that role. Jules Michelet, the great French historian of the 19th century, was one of the most eloquent builders of the image of the Middle Ages as a world of ignorance and physical misery. His passionate and often fanciful descriptions of that period influenced generations of readers and shaped popular perception with a force that more rigorous and more precise academic studies have never fully matched. Michelet was not describing the Middle Ages. He was using the Middle Ages as a stage for his own philosophical, political, and anti-clerical convictions. Romanticism, a cultural movement that spanned the 19th century with its tales of knights, castles, and maidens, contributed a paradoxical dimension to this process. At the same time that it created a glamorous and heroic image of the Middle Ages, Romanticism preserved and amplified the period's roughness and brutality as aesthetic elements. A medieval knight could be noble and courageous, but he lived in a harsh and primitive world, far removed from the comfort of Victorian bourgeoisie. This combination of glamour and rusticity consolidated an image of the era that mixed admiration and condescension inseparably. The result of centuries of these overlapping layers of interpretation, distortion, and instrumentalization was the myth that has reached us, a Middle Ages of universal filth, bodily ignorance, and indifference to cleanliness, serving simultaneously as a backdrop for epic fantasies and as a comforting contrast to the supposed superiority of the modern world. 20th century historiography, and especially that of the 21st century, has patiently and rigorously worked to dismantle this portrait. Researchers such as Lynn Thorndike, who as early as the first half of the 20th century argued against the view of the Middle Ages as an age of darkness, and more recently scholars, British, French, and American medievalists, who have delved into parish archives, household inventories, municipal records, and medical treatises, have been reconstructing piece by piece the image of a civilization far more complex, careful, and self-aware than the myth allowed one to see. This revision matters not only for understanding the past, it matters for understanding the present, because when we accept historical myths without question, we lose the ability to understand how human societies actually function, how knowledge is transmitted, how practices are formed and transformed, how ordinary people of other eras faced challenges that were not, in their human dimension, so different from the challenges we face today. The Middle Ages was a period of enormous difficulties, deep inequalities, and limited knowledge in the face of formidable adversities, but its inhabitants were complete human beings, with their values, their habits, their dignity, and their awareness of the world around them. They were not the filthy barbarians that popular myth insists on portraying. They were people who washed when they could, who cared for their bodies within their means, who built systems of collective hygiene, who produced soap and perfume, who regulated public baths, who wrote treatises on health and cleanliness, and who, in their own way, sought the same thing any human civilization seeks, to live with dignity in a difficult world. To recognize this is not to romanticize the past, it is simply to do it justice. And doing justice to the past is always a way of better understanding the present. If this documentary has managed to plant that seed of curiosity and critical thinking, it has already fulfilled its most important role. If this journey through the Middle Ages and its misunderstood hygiene habits made sense to you, consider leaving a like on this video. It helps bring this narrative to more people who, like you, care about the real history behind the myths. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next documentary investigations, and leave in the comments which aspect of the Middle Ages you'd like to see demystified next time. Every comment is a conversation worth having. Until the next narrative,